probably not a surprise to you that Cheryl and I are standing here in a clear cut. A clear cut is a silvicultural system. That's an even-aged silvicultural system. So the forest stand that regenerates is going to be one where all of the trees are the same stage. And in a clear cut, you simply cut every tree within your stand area that you're going to harvest. And in this case, this clear cut was done as part of a research project, but clear cuts are a silvicultural practice that you use on the Malcolm Knapp Research Forest. So can you talk a little bit about what management objectives or considerations would lead you to choose a clear cut versus some other silvicultural systems?
Yeah, so it is, as you say, a silvicultural system in and of itself, as well as being a sort of a regeneration method. And so besides from the objective of having the opportunity to grow an even age stand, like just a, kind of a single age class, the other thing that you're doing is you're creating regenerating and growing conditions that are free from any influence from the previous stand. So you don't have shading or forest edge effects. So for species that are suitable for that level and size of disturbance, if that's a part of the ecology of the species, that can be a favorable way to regrow them. Within reason. I mean, one of the interesting things about clear cuts is it's all relative. If a clear cut gets too small, it's really not a clear cut anymore, because then the effect of the stand edge is influencing those regeneration conditions, right? And so it needs to be, far enough away from any surrounding stand edges to be considered a clear cut. And then, if you look at this one that we're standing in right here, you might think, well, how big of a clear cut is this? Is it 1 hectare? Is it 10? Is it 100? Oh my God, it looks huge. But it's actually, this one here is about 5 hectares. So it's relatively small as clear cuts go. But it is, as I said, it's one of the silvicultural systems that we want to demonstrate here. We do quite a range of different things here.
And we're just seeing, you're probably seeing only about a quarter of this. I'll walk around with the camera in a minute so you can see a little bit more.
I'm not sure what the camera sees. I can see about a little more than half of it probably from here, but yeah.
Okay. So of the species that you're managing for here, my impression is that Douglas fir is probably the one that's best suited.
Yeah, this would be particularly suitable for Douglas fir. But the interesting thing is even trees that are capable of growing in shade and that are more shade tolerant, they can still thrive in these conditions too. So there's absolutely no reason why Sitka spruce, white pine, western red cedar, and western hemlock, they'll all grow in a clear cut too. Okay.
So the main thing is that they're all capable of growing in a clear cut, but competition-wise, the Douglas fir is going to be the really fast growing
potentially
of those.
Potentially, and some of that is subject to the amount of forest soil disturbance too. And also just the ecological site attributes in the first place. You got to remember, you can apply a clear cut to a whole range of different site series. So those are other factors that may favor one species over the other. But all other things being equal, this is particularly going to give an advantage to a real light demanding, nutrient demanding, intolerant pioneer type species like a Douglas fir.
And I know traditionally, especially in forestry in BC in the past 50 to 75 years, clear cuts were often dominant in large areas of the province and often very uniform in size and often very uniform in shape.
Yeah,
too.
That's right.
In the clear cuts that you do here, is there some variation in those things, or do the clear cuts in different areas tend to be similar?
Well, over time, really large clear cuts have sort of gone by the wayside because there are other values quite often, right? There are biodiversity values, there are scenic values, there are habitat values. There's a whole host of reasons why even terrain stability and watershed hydrology can be really important. You don't want these clear cuts to occupy too much of a watershed, because then they can start to have effects once they get to a certain level in size and frequency. So they tend to have become smaller, but they are still, an ecologically suitable silvicultural system here on the coast. Because, like I said, Douglas fir, is a pioneer, and most of the other conifer and many of the broadleaf species too, they're really well adapted to growing after fairly severe large-scale disturbances. Still overall, the most important site disturbance type here is still wildfire.
Yeah.
And they don't occur very often, but the species are adapted to it. And historically, those wildfires may have come hundreds of years apart, but those really large, severe stand-initiating wildfires, they would open up areas like this. Perhaps with more legacy trees, though, left behind. And that's one of the reasons why we really like to have retention now, as opposed to, clear cut. I'm much more likely to do a clear cut with some dispersed retention or some wildlife tree patches.
Can you talk a little bit more about your strategy for retention and clear cuts on the forest here?
Yeah, well, and then in that regard, it's we might call it a clear cut with reserves or some kind of a retention system. So it's starting to deviate away from this full on clear cut here. But yeah, the strategy is that we're going to do a range of things here, but quite often we are going to leave some dispersed or grouped retention. Most often it's fairly dispersed, and we're doing that because of biodiversity and ecological values and just long-term forest health and resilience.
And I know in some cases in clear cuts, even if they aren't reserves per se, but the boundaries of the clear cuts are drawn such that there are some areas of forest that kind of extend into the clear cut to minimize the distance. To make it within the clear cut, there aren't any points that are greater than a certain threshold distance from the edge. Is that something that
Right.
you
I
do
mean,
here?
there's a lot of things you need to take into consideration when you're planning a logging cut block. I mean, there's issues of sort of just operational and economic feasibility too, and you can only get so convoluted before you might be, for example, compromising safety.
Yeah.
And worker safety is really, really crucial too. So, but yeah, overall, we tend to be less inclined to make squares.
Yeah.
We don't want to see squares on the landscape. We want to follow, natural boundaries and, just emulate the natural disturbance pattern better on the landscape wherever we can.
And from an operational perspective, is it correct that clear cuts from the logging perspective are kind of the simplest because you don't have to, like when you have retention, you have to be very careful when you're harvesting around those trees that you aren't damaging those trees and counteracting their value, whereas with a clear cut you can kind of cut in an order dictated by safety or operational efficiency and not have to worry about those things.
Yeah, that's right. And the higher the retention level, especially if you get into older or more unstable stand types, you've got to be very, very careful about that safety factor. And then you put those higher retention systems onto steeper terrain on top of that. So, it can compound safety issues, and that's a very, very serious matter. So it's not just preventing damage to, the trees that you want to leave behind, but hey, damage to people too, and it's a real thing. It's very real thing. So
and my impression is that
take all that into consideration.
My understanding is that given the topography and the other constraints here, I know like where I'm from in Wisconsin with much flatter terrain, the harvesting is often done by a person operating a large machine, and they're in a cab, and they're relatively protected. Yeah. But here, your cutters, they're mostly out and cutting with saws. Is that the case, or is it a mix?
It's a mix. The machines have become, lighter in footprint and more able to tilt and grip the terrain and operate more safely on steeper and steeper ground. And in the future, we're looking towards possible use of, tethered systems where cables could help stabilize machines. So there's generally a movement to using mechanical falling, more than hand falling than we used to. But there is most definitely still lots of terrain at this time, in British Columbia and in many places in the world that still need to be hand felled because you just can't get a machine onto that kind of terrain.
Yeah. So it's mostly just an issue of access and topography and what the landscape is like, but all things being equal, it's substantially safer to have the person cutting that tree protected in the cab of the machine than being standing next to the tree that they're cutting down.
Yeah, certainly.